You're listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
Dr. Michael Bassett is a former Labour Party MP who retired in 1990. He's also a political historian, and Michael and I love delving into that history. I thought Michael would be a great guest to have on The Crunch to give a history-based perspective on this election, and he's here to talk personalities, politics, parties, who's great, who's dreadful, and get his reckons on this election. Welcome to The Crunch, Michael.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, this is an exciting election. I don't know about you, but it certainly is for me. I think we're seeing something unusual happening out there. And so I thought I'd get someone who is a keen observer of elections over decades to share with our listeners some of your observations about where we're at and where we're heading.
Well, that's nice to be asked. I'm not finding it a particularly exciting campaign. I don't think that either of the leading candidates is particularly exciting, leading the parties. The best by far, and the one who, is the voice of the future is David Seymour.
Yes.
With David on the one hand at 40 and Winston at 78, you're left thinking, heavens, who's interested in the future of the country?
Well, it appears both of those people are interested in the future of the country, but perhaps taking it from a different approach. And I guess with MMP and the advent of MMP, and of course you left Parliament before MMP arrived, so you never had to deal with the beast, so to speak. But I think MMP forces people to at least try and work together.
Well, up to a point, yes, but it fractionalizes or fractionates, I'm not quite sure which the word is there, the political process. I mean, my political life was one where the Labour Party incorporated everybody from quite a significant chunk of the business community through to the extreme left, and you had to sort of find your position within the Labour Party. National had its own extremes, and so you learnt to work within the party. Once you got MMP, you ended up with people being rewarded, if you like, for having a difference. And you only had to persuade 5% or win a seat. And you had your party. And I think that MMP has actually divided this country terribly.
I think also that MMP gave far too much power to the parties, which was not what was intended by the voters when they selected MMP.
I agree with that.
Yeah, they thought that they were going to keep the power of the parties under control. And I think MMP actually expanded the power of the parties, but so much so that it created a cult of personality where blind adherence to the leader trumps the core philosophy of the founding principles of each party.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think that the leadership of the parties was very important and has always been, ever since the days of Dick Seddon. Seddon, Ward, Massey were big figures. So was Coates, not Forbes so much, but Mickey Savage was incredibly important to Labour's first victory in 1935. And Peter Fraser, who was Prime Minister when I was a young fellow growing up, and so on over the years. Yes, I think possibly the leaders are a little more important now, but not very much. They've always been important, is my line.
I mean, we've seen, in recent days, Christopher Luxon, reprimanding one of his MPs for a stance that he put on Twitter or Facebook, whatever it was, 10 years ago, and making that MP say, oh, no, I'm in agreement with the leader, I'm in agreement with the party, with this, with that. it strikes me as, National Party and the Labour Party in particular used to be a broad church that accepted people with different views, and now it seems that at the behest of the media almost, there's this gotcha type thing which then creates this homogenized view of what the Labour Party or the National Party is.
You've put your finger on it there, Cameron. I agree completely that the media, I think the standard of the media has slipped in this country. The media in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, there were some incredible journalists around, really able people. Nowadays, you're looking at people who think they're doing a wonderful job when they engage in a sort of a gotcha moment, where something doesn't quite tally with something you said some little time ago, as though anybody cares much.
Well, that's the thing that strikes me is this gotcha politics stuff is not actually extending political debate in any way. It's I'm going to get you no matter what for something you did 15, 20, 30. I mean, we saw this with John Key, didn't we? When the media hounded him constantly over the years on his stance over the Springbok tour, like anyone cared 30 years later.
Yes, quite. But those things are very important to lesser mortals who have a job in the media and who themselves have very inadequate educations for the most part.
Now, you've written a blog post recently. It's on the BASSETT, Brash and Hyde website where you're talking about the media in quite a bit of detail. And some of the things that the media are doing, and in fact forcing the opposition and also the government into making silly electoral mistakes because they're reacting to the media.
Yes, and really the thrust of that article that I wrote was that by concentrating all the time on picayune little bits of National's tax policy, they were just advertising, the media were advertising to the world and his wife that National had tax relief in its policy and making it therefore more likely that people would take an interest in it. I don't happen to think that National's tax policy is all that good. I'm not sure it's even wise at this moment. But having said that, they have issued the policy and the media is advertising its existence like there's no tomorrow.
And Christopher Hipkins, all he's talking about is National's tax cuts. And they're at the stage, I've seen this before, I saw it, at the end of the Bolger-Shipley years, where the incumbent can say whatever they want, but no one's listening to them anymore. And all they hear from Christopher Hipkins is National's tax cuts, blah, 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 National's tax cuts, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And it's perpetuating exactly what you're saying, that the media are following. I mean, I was sitting down with a prominent lawyer just yesterday for breakfast, and he was saying, this National's tax cut thing doesn't add up. And I said to him, mate, no one cares. Like literally no one cares. It's something that can be fixed later, but no one cares because they just don't want to hear anything more from anyone wearing a red jacket or a red sweatshirt or a red T-shirt. They just don't want to hear it anymore.
Well, it may well be that, but we've had moments like that in our history. In the article I wrote, I compared it a little bit to Sir Joseph Ward coming back after years and years and years in the wilderness and leading the opposition into the 1928 election and misreading his speech notes. And in the opening of his campaign in the Auckland Town Hall, instead of saying that he would borrow abroad over 10 years a sum of £70 million, he had a sort of a blue funk because he was in a diabetic kind of state, and said he'd borrow the 70 million in 1 year. Well, of course, the media went absolutely berserk, as did the government of the day. And all they did was advertise Ward's policy. And they talked about it so much and belted him around. This poor old boy, he was 72 and frail, and they belted him about, and he was elected. And I think Chippy is busy doing the same thing with talking on and on about tax cuts of nationals. I suspect it'll be the primary thing he talks about tonight in the debate with Luxon.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to that debate, because I think that we're going to see two people with a bunch of strap lines that they've rehearsed. And doesn't matter what the question is, they're going to deliver those strap lines, and it's going to be an unedifying performance from both of them. It isn't going to fill either of us with confidence.
I fear you're right.
Yeah, the people that you're mentioning from the past, the big names, the profiles of those leaders, but they also did big things. Yeah. And I think back in the MMP era in particular, and I can't think of a single big thing that has been done in the MMP era. Most of it's small beer stuff, tinkering at the outside. I'm really struggling to see something that is as important as, say, your 1989 local body reforms, or the think big things that Muldoon did that, ironically everybody opposed, but now we're all sitting there clutching onto the power that those things generate. These were big things that were done. Michael Joseph Savage, state housing.
Yes.
What has anybody done in the modern MMP era that's big in your view?
I think the biggest was KiwiSaver.
Right. Okay. Yep. I'll accept that. I think
Michael Cullen's KiwiSaver really meant something for a wide number of people. The government that I was in, the Kirk government, in the 1970s, introduced a superannuation scheme which Muldoon canned, and then brought in his own system in 1976-7. But KiwiSaver was really a big one. And, people are able to calculate when they'd like to retire, and conscious of what their assets are going to be and how much they'll need and what the state of health is. And that's been a huge thing.
Is there anything that John Key did that was big?
No, not much. Well, the biggest things he did were retrograde, like sending, what's his name, Sharples off to sign up to the Indigenous rights notion. Maori are not Indigenous to New Zealand. I mean, I grew up and you grew up in a world where we were told about how they sailed their canoes from Hawaii. And it was to Hawaii that their spirits returned when they died. And so that was a mistake. And it was made because John knew nothing about New Zealand history. I don't think he's ever read much. And now, what was his second big mistake?
The flag.
Oh, the flag, yes. Well, that was a sort of a silly notion, and he misjudged the public very seriously on that.
Yeah, I had a discussion with him at the time, and I said to him, "You're wrong on this, and you're going to be proved wrong." And he rather arrogantly suggested to me that his power of persuasion was more efficient and more effective at changing people's minds than my opposition to changing the flag. And I said to him, well, he even said to me, look, the Labour Party even has it as one of their election promises to change the flag. And I said, you don't think that's going to last 5 seconds after you announce you're going to change the flag, do you? They'll oppose changing the flag because you're suggesting it. And that was the pure politics of it. And in many respects, I don't think John Key understood pure politics. Yes, he could be advised sensibly. He had some great advisors around him, but I don't think on that issue, his instincts were anywhere near what the public thought.
And remember, it was quite late in his time at the top, and people were tiring of him. His other great failure was his failure to honour the promise that he made in 2008 to get the New Zealand economy performing as well as Australia's.
Mm.
And he impaneled Don Brash and a number of other high-powered people to come up with a template on how it could be done. But it just required a little bit much concentration and a little bit more rigorous self-control than he wanted to engage in. And so they battered it away, and the New Zealand economy has slid in relation to Australia ever since.
It's interesting you say that he didn't concentrate on some of these things in a way that he should have. And I put that down to the MMP environment and our rather short, by international standards, 3-year term. And the people who are reforming type politicians, and we can probably count them on the fingers of one hand, they tend to do things with a great hiss and a roar in the first year, settle it down in the second, and then talk about anything else but that in the third so that they can get re-elected.
Well, there's an element of truth in that, I think, a big element of truth in it. But John Key reminded me very much of Keith Holyoake, and I argue that in my book, The Prime Ministers. Holyoake campaigned, I think it was "Steady as She Goes," or some slogan like that in the 60s. And that was basically John Key's approach. So long as I can stay at the top as Prime Minister and not alienate too many people, that's good for New Zealand. Well, mistaking yourself for the benefit of your country is not a great look.
No, and as soon as he realised that it was going to be touch and go at the next election, he cut and run. And I really have a personal objection to MPs and prime ministers who stood on the hustings and told us that they were going to be there for the long haul. And when the going gets tough, they disappear, and for family reasons or whatever reason they concoct to exit. No gas in the tank in the case of Ardern.
And in Key's case, don't forget, he said more or less the same.
Yeah. So they just bugger off into the ether and then turn up about, a year later as some sort of commentator on anything that anybody's talking about. And, they really should just shut up. You've left, go away. Anything you had to say was important when you were in, but it's not important now. And it just grinds my gears that people, the media in particular, keep going back to these people who, when the going got tough, they cut and run. There's no intestinal fortitude anymore in politicians.
I presume the problem of wanting to comment after you've left office comes from the fact that you're so used to the limelight, and you're so used to and so opinionated on so many things that you can't bear not being questioned and not being seen to have an opinion. It's a personal problem that all politicians have winding down. I understand it a little bit myself.
Yeah, I always say to politicians, you need to stay grounded, because one day you're not going to be a politician. And you'll know that day because that's the day your phone stops ringing and people stop actually calling you to hear what you've got to say about anything, or you're no use to them anymore, so they don't ring you. But one thing is certain, they'll stop ringing you.
Yeah. Oh, that's true to a point. It depends. Some people stay too long and retire too late. I got out of politics at 52, and I still had years of activity left in me. And I went off and did a whole lot of other things, and I kept busy. But I feel sorry for somebody who gets to 78 and still can't work out what on earth can occupy his mind in his remaining years.
Well, he would say he's a patriot and he wants to sort things out.
Well, a fat lot of help that'll be. I mean, he gave us Jim Bolger in 1996. He kept Helen Clark in 2005. He gave us Jacinda in 2017, and now I think regrets it deeply. I mean, who's going to really follow his judgment and think, gosh, he's finally cracked it. He can be trusted. Come on, give me a break.
Oh, but he's enigmatic, really, isn't he? And a bit of a rascal and a scallywag and fun to watch in action.
Yes, but our country can only tolerate scallywags up to a point. You've got to remain serious. Otherwise, you'll go to hell in a handcart.
Well, that's where we're sitting at the moment economically, isn't it? We've got a bunch of people who really don't understand the basics of economics trying desperately to spend their way out of economic doldrums.
Yes, and they're busy criticising everybody else for spending, and yet every single day Hipkins announced some new expenditure. I mean, there were, what was it yesterday? Solar panels and subsidies for solar panels. I can't imagine anything more geared towards upper income groups who can afford to install solar panels than that little thing. And the day before it was something else. Oh, extending the years for mammograms, was it? And I mean, every day there's some new expenditure coming out of the government, which told us last week with the preview that the room for manoeuvring is very, very small financially.
Well, you know, and some of the things that they're announcing are things they've announced 6 years ago, and they still haven't delivered them. I mean, do you remember Jacinda Ardern saying that this year was the year of delivery? Well, I think the post office went AWOL that year because nothing got delivered.
The post office has almost given up, or except, of course, for the courier service, which is splendid. I mean, it is the best of the courier services, but the old penny postage of Sir Joseph Ward's has long gone.
Oh, I don't think people write letters anymore. You know, how many people actually bother to check their letterbox for anything these days?
Yeah, I posted a letter last week, but it was the first time for a long time.
Well, you know what you could have? You should have got someone to video that, stuck it on TikTok. You know, Michael Bassett posts a letter, and it probably would have had 10 million global views. He was somebody using a letterbox,
snail mail.
Yeah.
Yes.
In the modern era. And I say modern era, let's just draw a line and say it's 1996 with the advent of MMP. Are there any standout politicians for you as a historian that you'd say, I'd really like to dig into a bit about them rather than, a couple of pages in a book of collection of leaders? Is there anyone who stood out for you as an admirable leader who did things to make New Zealand better?
Well, since 1996 to today, the most important politician by far would be Helen Clark.
Mm.
I mean, she would be second to Peter Fraser as Labour's most important leader. Mickey Savage is there as in the background as the great man of the early 1930s, mid 1930s. But Helen is a force of nature, really. And she had a phenomenal way of going about governing. But what did she really achieve? KiwiSaver, yes. She put a dampener on the foreshore and seabed silliness that the Supreme Court had undertaken in 2003. But of course, eventually the National Party changed that for the worse in 2011. What else did she do? She certainly, her health policy was pretty significant. And I think the education policy within the limits of her MPs were not bad. But your question really is, tell me who's been really significant since 1996. And apart from Helen Clark and Michael Cullen as her assistant, I don't think there's been anybody who's really significant. Don Brash flashed across the scene for 5 seconds and has left an imprint in some areas, particularly in race relations and his constant push for equal opportunities rather than special advantages for Maori. But other than that, we're scratching the bottom of the barrel to find really significant people who will go down in New Zealand history.
Yeah, Helen Clark was someone that I didn't agree with her politics or her methods, but I could admire her abilities in politics. I mean, to steer down Michael Cullen and a couple of others, for the leadership. And I mean, she literally steered them down and said, no, you're wrong, go away. And then to go on and win the election, the 1999 election.
Probably her biggest move there, Cam, I think, was probably getting Anderton on the side.
Yes.
We forget that Anderton was polling quite high around 1994-5, declined in 1996 a bit, but he was still there and had a capacity to divide Labour. And that peace agreement that was made between Clark and Anderton in 1998 was very important to Helen's eventual win in 1999.
I guess the other thing too is she managed to last 3 terms, and we hadn't seen that from the Labour Party for decades.
No,
they were considered to be a 1-term or at best 2-term party, but not a 3-term party.
Certainly in modern times, they got 1935, 38, 43, 46. They got 4 terms initially. But yes, you're right. Then it was a 1-termer in the 57 to 60, a 1-termer 72, 75, 2 terms 84 to 90, and then the 3 terms of Helen Clark's. Yes, it was an extraordinary performance, delivered, of course, by MMP and by Winston and Peter Dunn.
And now we've got the modern Labour Party, the current mob that are in there. Jacinda Ardern led them to a historic win in 2020 when most of New Zealand was still in thrall and suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. That's my description of it anyway. But it was a historic MMP win with an outright majority to the Labour Party. And then 2 short years later, she was gone, leaving Chris Hipkins to, it appears, rather ineptly defend the ground that she led. And they look like they're going to lose.
Well, yes. Well, 2 terms is particularly, I mean, one of the things about this Labour Party, it's not the Labour Party I was ever a member of. In fact, I'm embarrassed to admit I was Labour because people think I might be a supporter of this appalling government. But, the old Labour Party was about a hand up. It wasn't about a hand out.
Yeah.
If there was to be a handout to people, it was for some specific limited purpose. Not this government. This government believes in splashing money around everywhere. If you've got an itch, they'll scratch it.
But we're looking at a return possibly of Labour not lasting 3 terms. And I've talked to Matt McCartan about this, and he said to me that, Cam, you've got to remember that New Zealand politics is about halves. So you win an election and you get given 3 years. That's the first half of a game. And if you played okay, then the voters will give you the right to have a second half and complete 6 years.
Yes.
But then when you come to the 3rd term, if they've given you that ability to do 2 terms, you're now playing another game which has got 2 halves in it. which is why at the end of the third term, people have had enough of you and you don't get to play the second half of the full amount to get 4 terms. Would you agree with that?
Yes, more or less. The third term for Helen Clark was important in one sense. It enabled KiwiSaver to be cemented in. And as we were saying, that was a very significant milestone. But yes, third terms are dangerous in the sense that they do open up a sort of a tiredness factor that can tell against a government. I mean, at present, there are not many people around who don't think that a change of government would improve things. I mean, I think most people are thinking, oh my God, I'd like change. Do I trust National Enact? That's those that will vote Labour. And the others are just saying, oh, to hell with Labour. We've had them long enough. Let's get rid of them.
And when that's the prevailing feel that I get, I can look at the numbers. I can be like David Farrar and look at the numbers and say, look, okay, Labour has lost 50% of their support from the previous election. Again, he says that's unprecedented. He's never seen that happen in New Zealand politics before. Now, true, he hasn't been around New Zealand politics for as long as you, but
he's not as old.
Yeah, I'm scratching my head and I can't think of a single instance where a governing party has lost 50% or more of their support. Sure, 10%, maybe 20%. If we look back at the end of the Muldoon years when Bob Jones set up the New Zealand Party and grabbed 15% of the vote. For 12, for no seat. At one stage he was polling around 20, if I recall. But he got 12, but that was enough to change the government, 12%. And that's one of the biggest, swings that I've seen traditionally, and particularly under MMP. A swing of 5% will change the government. But we're seeing 50% just gone.
You've got to remember that under MMP, no government has gotten remotely near 50% of the total vote, which Jacinda got in 2020. And that in itself is remarkable and must make that scene that you've just painted look a little more extreme. Yes. Well, it's I can't think of any case off the cuff. Perhaps Labour's defeat in 1990, there was a significant fall off there. The vote was about 48% in 1987 and fell back to 35, I think it was. 34 or 35 in 1990. That was quite a fall off, but you're right, it's much more serious this time.
Well, 1990 it was 12.82% swing.
Okay.
Away from Labour, 12.82, and the government changed, and that was a landslide election.
Yeah.
What was I'll just look up 1975 and we'll see what that says.
That was a pretty significant switch too, as was 72. I mean, 72 and 75, the winning government, the winning party got a majority of 23 seats in each of those elections.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you'll be surprised to know that it was an 8.8% swing in 1975.
Okay.
So that's,
not
again,
that great in today's day and age.
No, and it was a 3.7% swing against Jack Marshall in 72. So that was an even smaller swing that changed the government. And we're looking at a 50% swing here at the moment.
Yes.
On the polls. And I imagine there'll be another poll this week, which will I just sit here looking at these polls and I'm thinking back, when was the last time we saw 7 polls released in 10 days that all said the same thing? I mean, I'm a political tragic. We look at these polls and you always look for one that's got a glimmer of hope for you, and you think, oh, all the others are rogue, or that one's a rogue, or whatever.
Yeah.
This was blood on the floor. in 10 days, 7 polls in 10. I don't think I've ever seen that before.
No,
and
it's like the British polls. I mean, they're polling all the time. I think it must be that polling is a very expensive thing, and the newspapers have been in free fall for years here, and they've polled less and less, and radio doesn't have the money to do it. So what did you make? Can I ask you a question? What did you make of the Roy Morgan poll?
Well, I tend to not look at polls as an individual poll. I look at the trend.
Yes.
What's the trend telling me? I mean, the Roy Morgan poll, it's always been a bit suspect. They poll from Australia. They have a different methodology to what a lot of other polls run. Maybe it's a bit of jealousy that it's an Australian polling company and not a New Zealand polling company. It's always kind of been favouring to the left. I'm not sure that left and right exists anymore, but it used to favour the left. It shows Winston Peters probably a little bit higher at that stage than he perhaps was, although he's done a couple of things that may see him leap up a little bit. But
and Seymour polling very well, and ACT, they were I think they were at 18%, and I'm not sure they're at 18%, although
I don't think they are.
They're higher than 12, I think.
Yeah, it's funny because David Seymour was at one of my staff parties in 2021, after the 2020 election in January, talking to a group of people, and somebody said, "Oh, okay, David, you've done really well. Where do you see ACT going from here?" And his answer was rather strange. He said, "Look, I only see the ACT party as a 10% party. Once we start getting over 10%, it gets a bit wobbly. And I'm just concentrating on producing a good 10% party that can be reliable as a coalition partner." And I think back to those days now, and I look at what he said last week, where he effectively threatened the National Party by saying that and it was a bizarre threat too, because it doesn't make any sort of political, logical sense, where he said, I could give national confidence, but I'll treat supply on a case-by-case matter. Well, if you don't give supply, you're not giving confidence. And so it was a rather strange statement. What do you make of that?
I don't know that I would have phrased it quite the way he did. But, I mean, if you're an ACT person and you're looking at Nationals' policies and their statements, you really do sometimes ask yourself, is there a need to change the government? I mean, the National Party does seem to accept that just about everything that's in existence will be kept in existence, including 15,000 more state employees who are eating their heads off budget-wise, and all the mad changes. I haven't heard any indicator from the National Party that they're going to really undermine Te Whātu Ora. They might do away with the Maori-only component. And the education changes, I'm not greatly impressed by what I've heard. So what I'm really saying is, in relation to David Seymour, that he's going to negotiate point by point by point. If he's keeping that lot in cabinet, he wants some return, and the public would expect some return from ACT. And I think that what ACT's got to say on a whole lot of things, particularly on race relations, I mean, he's got a capacity to put some backbone into National.
I mean, that's the thing, is I should be a natural ACT Party voter. I have nothing to do with the National Party. I find them woke. I find them a deep shade of pink. I think that under Christopher Luxon, they're more left than Helen Clark's Labour government, and that says a lot. And I agree with you. I don't think that National will unwind very much at all about what Labour has done in the last 6 years. Some of the most appalling divisive policies that have been brought in. And everything I hear from Christopher Luxon and Christopher Bishop and Nicola Willis, who are the wet woke wombles at the top of the pile in the party now, is that they would be a more efficient form of the Labour Party, that they're the other side of the same coin that the Labour Party is on.
I think you can argue that that's been national through history. I mean, the hiss and roar that Sid Holland promised during the 40s turned out to be no more than pulling away subsidies in 1950 and treating the trade union movement tough in 1951, but then falling into line with Fintan Patrick Walsh and the union movement during the 50s. And Holyoake's government was very much a sort of steady as she goes, let's play the game that Labour has left for us. And Muldoon was, if anything, more radical than Labour with his controls and this capacity to try to screw the economy down. Bolger, no great change much. And we now find that he's a little sorry that he wasn't more left. He's
the Malcolm Fraser of New Zealand politics.
Yes, he is a bit. It's quite a good analogy. And John Key was absolutely a steady as she goes, don't let's rock the boat kind of a politician.
So I've always described the National Party as the party of the status quo. They're efficient managers of what Labour left before them.
That's about it. I think you're right on it there, Cam.
Yeah, and that's why I'm struggling a bit with who to vote for in this election. I can't bring myself to vote for the National Party. Their behaviour during the COVID years was to say that they would have done everything that Jacinda Ardern did, all the divisiveness. They just would have been more efficient fascists in implementing it and stomping on our rights. David Seymour has said some appalling things and done some appalling things. He's somebody who has paraded himself around the country as a bastion of free speech. Now, free speech can only exist if you support all the other rights that support that. I mean, people mock the United States, but the US Constitution is almost a perfect document where the right to free speech is the First Amendment, and that's protected by the right to bear arms in order to ensure that the right to free speech exists as the Second Amendment, and everything flows from there. We don't have anything like that.
Where does David fall down on all of that, though?
Well, I know you're an ACT Party, stalwart, but
I'm not a stalwart, but I'm almost certainly going to vote for him.
This is before 2021 and 2022. He was touring the country making speeches about free speech and how important it was and all that. And yet when a bunch of people turned up on the forecourt of Parliament to express their free speech, he refused to listen. He refused to engage. And here was the bastion of rights that he has put the ACT Party out as being. And yet he joined in with the governing party with deriding these people who were in serious pain.
I think you're going too far there. I mean, you're putting a gloss on that rabble that were in Parliament building.
Well, I was one of those, Michael.
Well, that's all right. I mean, there were some quite good people there, but there were a hell of a lot of losers.
Well, I wouldn't put them as losers. They were put in a position by an uncaring government that told them that they were caring, while at the same time shutting down their businesses, their jobs, destroying their families, and all the other things.
That's what those guys were doing around Parliament. They more or less ruined business within about a 1 mile radius for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Well, we'd have to disagree on that because I was there, and you could go further out away from the Parliament area, and Wellington was dead, and it was dead because the vast majority of people who live and work in Wellington are working for corporates or the government, and all of those businesses were in stay-at-home work from home environments, and many still are. which is why the whole economy in Wellington has gone through the floor. And it was a convenient excuse to blame, a bunch of people who were protesting about appalling degradations of human rights. And we're all told that it was all wonderful, this is okay, and they had a choice, and all of this, there was no choice.
There's an element of truth in what you're saying, but only an element of truth. For every genuine person around Parliament, there was a troublemaker as well. And what David Seymour did on balance was to try and keep away from them, believing that there were more of the troublemakers than there were good people. I think in retrospect, he possibly would have spent a bit more time and gone and seen them. But anyway, that's small stuff.
Well, as I say, you can't put the poo back in the donkey, But one thing I would suggest, Michael, if you've got time, is to go and watch River of Freedom, the movie that was released last week about the Wellington protest. And you might find your view changes a little bit if you watch that movie. It's very moving, very powerful, and it actually shows what I witnessed when I was at the Wellington protest. River of Freedom, yep. Go and watch that. It's well worth it. It's beautifully put together, and it shows what I think is a more true example rather than the appalling documentaries that Stuff has put together in Radio New Zealand and various other, agitprop organisations in the media. And when you actually see what was going on behind the scenes and the mass movement that there was to make such a thing happen, you realise that there is some fighting spirit in New Zealand, and we still do have that old Kiwi mentality of working together on things. And I think it would change your mind.
Oh, I'll have a look.
Yeah. So you described this government as an appalling government.
Yeah.
Right? You're a historian. Have there been worse ones, or is this one actually the worst?
Not in my lifetime. I'm prepared to believe that the 30 to 35 government was pretty bad, although Coates, when he joined the government became Minister of Finance in 1933, certainly started to turn around the Forbes government. But that one possibly was worse. I can't think back to another one since 1890 that would have been as bad as this government. I mean, your real problem with this government is just simply that you've got a whole collection of student politicians. None of them has really done anything of significance in their lives except sit around Parliament and, wisecrack. And none of them does any reading. I don't think Chris Hipkins reads at all. He builds rock gardens, I'm told, and looks after his garden.
Eats sausage rolls.
Yes, oh yes. But he doesn't read. He doesn't know anything about New Zealand history. Grant Robertson knows nothing about New Zealand history and had never done economics, I gather, at university.
He knows even less about economics, yeah.
Quite. And, I'm just not used to governments led by people who know nothing. Carmel Sepuloni is a disaster. Talk about getting the incentives wrong for poor people. I mean, that's why poverty is actually significantly worse now than it was in 2017. This government's actually created poverty and will go on creating more poverty with the sorts of social welfare policies they've got. And the education system is just, don't start me.
So that's quite an indictment, really, that this is in your...
This is my lifetime, and I'm 85.
Yeah, your lifetime. This is the worst government, and even you can look through the lens of history, being a historian, and sort out the publicity from fact. And you're saying this is the worst government ever. in New Zealand.
Yes, with the possible exception of 30 to 35.
Yeah, but that's 3 years. So this is 6 years. So 6 years beats 3 years. So let's just talk about how it got like that. Andrew Little was not a spectacular leader. He's an unlovable, unlikable person. They put in Jacinda Ardern, and they were elected on nothing more than a slogan and some, massive policies that they couldn't even get close to delivering. I mean, if you put Jacinda Ardern in a room full of Lego, she'd struggle to build a house, let alone 100,000 houses. Yeah, these were big promises that they never delivered on and quietly shelved.
They didn't really have all that much detailed promise stuff in 2017. I mean, that's why they had those 300 committees, which were set up in 2018, really to tell them what to do. And, basically they were going to pull the whole world apart. And they're suffering as a result of doing so much damage to the fabric of New Zealand and lacking the administrative skills to be able to put it back together again. And who would say that the health system with Te Whatu Ora is performing better than the system with the district health boards prior to 2020? I mean, you'd have to be a fool to argue that health has significantly improved as a result of anything Labor has done. You'd have to be a complete mug and not read the newspapers even to believe that education has improved. They don't even begin to. Hipkins has really been responsible for the last 6 years of education, nearly all of it as the minister. And all that time, standards of education, reading, writing, arithmetic have all slid. And, oh dear. Falling government.
But there was so much promise.
I never believed it. You might have.
No, I never did. I met Jacinda Ardern in person in 2008. In Warrensville, of all places, when David Farrer and I were travelling around New Zealand in what we called the Blogmobile. We'd been gifted a motorhome, and this ACT Party supporter said, "Oh, come and have lunch at my place, and I'll get along a politician." And I thought, "Oh, okay, well, this will be interesting." David Farrer and I tip up at this place for lunch, and in comes Jacinda Ardern. Now, I sort of briefly knew who she was. I thought she was somewhat stupid. I haven't changed my opinion of her after that 3-hour lunch. In fact, it probably got worse, where she regaled us all with a selection of bumper sticker slogans and nothing more deep than that. And I thought, if this is the great white hope of the Labour Party, then they've got trouble. And then, little did I know that she was going to then become the Prime Minister. But I think she was as vacuous as a Prime Minister as she was at that lunch in 2008. David Farrer was, of course, smitten, as he is always, by a pretty face. But, my gut instinct said this woman hasn't got anything.
Well, in many respects, of course, she's a bit like Mickey Savage. I mean, Savage was no great brain. Savage didn't really master policy very well at all. Thank God he had Peter Fraser at his elbow and Nash. Otherwise, the first Labor government would have been a disaster. Labor has occasionally gone for people who are pretty faces and have a ready smile and have a positive outlook on life. And Mickey Savage had that, and Jacinda had that. But depth, intellectual depth and grunt, no. Neither of them.
It's been said that the COVID years were an effective coup, where Jacinda Ardern surrounded herself with about 5 ministers. We never saw or heard from any other minister for a good long period of time. We never saw press releases. We never saw them announcing anything. It was only Jacinda and Chris Hipkins and Grant Robertson and David Parker that we saw doing anything with, various deputies along the way, Kelvin Davis and now Carmel Sepuloni.
Andrew Little struggling with health, of course, and Michael Wood, who would have to be the most overrated pastime that Labor has ever had in any prominent position. The $785 million walking and cycling bridge, and dear.
Light rail to Mount Roskill, all of these fanciful things that he enthusiastically supports.
They're still spending money on light rail out to the airport at the same time as we're said to be nearly broke. Certainly, the preview suggests there's no extra money for anything.
Let's just touch on Michael Wood, because he was seen as the great white hope of the Labor Party, right? And I always thought he reminded me of Basil Brush, his demeanor and then as farcical as Basil Brush. And it turns out that my gut feel is right again. But I can't believe he wrecked his career for effectively a Big Mac, chips and a Coke.
Well, I really don't. I can only say what I've observed of him, but he was nothing like as bright or as well educated as the person he replaced as the
Phil Goff.
Phil Goff, and he just puffed up with his own self-importance.
His career highlight was measuring the inside seam of businessmen's legs at Hugh Wright's.
Yes, I gather that was it. It was what my mother called a counter jumper. Yeah.
So let's just wrap this up, Michael, by getting your assessment of who is there in the Labor Party that is going to possibly be their next leader and or next prime minister after they get eviscerated at this election. Is there anyone that you can think of, or is there anyone that springs to mind, or are they not yet born?
No, I mean, that's the problem. First, we don't know who's going to survive the election. A huge swathe, at least 20 Labor MPs are going to be defeated, even if you just accept the figures as they are now, the poll figures. So who's going to be left? Well, we'll have to have a look at that. But I don't see amongst any of them anybody with real leadership skills. If they do possess leadership skills, boy, they've been keeping them quiet. We've seen no evidence. So I'm coming back to your question. I mean, I'm inclined to think that the next leader of the Labor Party, the next effective one who will lead them back to office, isn't yet in Parliament.
Wow, that's pretty devastating. I mean, I'm looking at the numbers, and I think we could be looking at an overhang election here, where Labor wins more electorate seats than they're entitled to by their list score. Yeah. And but I'm also seeing the distinct possibility of a massive decapitation result where senior leaders like David Parker, who's one person who I despise personally but respect politically, he's slagged me off in Parliament for his own gain and all of that sort of thing, but that's just the cut and thrust of politics. He's well respected across the political spectrum for his political abilities and his management abilities, but he's seriously staring down the barrel of unemployment, along with every other person that's on the list, including Grant Robertson.
Well, Grant Robertson, of course, is just going to be a list MP and presumably he'll be in the next Parliament, but there won't be many others off the list for Labor. And as I say, I think their next winner isn't yet in the House. But where is that person? I mean, the CTU has not exactly covered itself in glory this campaign. In fact, they've proven themselves to be the normal corrupt outfit that they always have been. And you're not looking at any traditional Labourish kind of background that's got a star that will go into Parliament and do anything.
It's almost like they've forgotten that they're the working man's party, or the working person's party, if we're going to be politically correct.
Defining what the working man is, it becomes, of course, more difficult as time moves on. And instead of people being good, honest tradies out there, of which we've got a shortage these days, whole swathes of people are in IT and, all sorts of other jobs which weren't thought of in the days when the term the working man's party was invented.
Yeah, I think Chris Trotter had a really good analogy that he hasn't used for a number of years. He used it, during the David Cunliffe leadership debacle. He described a typical Labour voter as Waitakere man, a blue-collar type person, maybe middle management as well, toiling away, paying the mortgage. Kids go to an average school. They live in an average suburb out west. It seems to me that work ethic, that Kiwi can-do attitude is sadly being destroyed over at least the last 6 years, and possibly, a little bit longer than that. That we no longer listen to the ordinary Kiwi.
Yes, I think the makeup of the workers in the country is changing all the time, of course. The demographic changes are very considerable. And I think back to the Te-Atutu that I represented in Parliament, and they were tradies with a caravan on the front lawn. Often they go off to Orewa at Christmas time, and people who were quite unlike what would be called the working man today. Yes, of course, there are tradies around, thank God. Who else is going to do your plumbing and your electrical work? But the sort of ordinary workforce is a different creature to what it used to be.
Yeah, totally different. And I'm just thinking of the current Te-Atutu MP, Phil Twyford, and some of his grandiloquent statements about Kiwi build. And I'm surprised the National Party, or indeed the ACT Party, hasn't gone through and pulled all the video of that and turned it into ads and saying, well, where are the houses, Mr. Twyford?
Yes, or probably they don't want to give a look at or give too much publicity to some of the appalling stuff that has been built. I mean, there's some just gross housing around Auckland that is a result of Kiwi build.
Yeah, just appalling. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Michael. It's always fascinating when we get together. I think the last time we got together was outside the Civic Theatre when we were crossing paths, and we spent about half an hour talking, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's a long time ago, Cam.
It is. A lot's gone under the bridge, but it's always a pleasure picking your brains about history. And I'm an amateur historian. I have a particular interest in military history and political history. But it's always good to touch base with people like yourself. And in the past, I spoke with Barry Gustafsson and people like that, because if you don't learn from history, then you're just going to repeat a lot of the mistakes that have happened in the past. And that's what I see the Labour Party doing now. And you've described them as the most appalling government in New Zealand political history.
Lifetime.
Well, in your lifetime, but you can't find anything actually in history in New Zealand either. So it's not just your lifetime. It's the whole of, as long as we've had politics and parliament in New Zealand, these are the worst. And that's quite some label to put on them. But, I actually agree with you, and I'll be glad to see the back of them. But what scares me the most is that we have a strong National Party that's not being kept in check by either David Seymour and Winston Peters working in conjunction with each other. That's what frightens me the most, is that Christopher Luxon just isn't strong enough to, do what's necessary to turn this country around.
they'll work together when the results come in on the 14th of October. Let's just hope they've got the numbers to make for a better New Zealand.
Well, let's hope you and I get our wish that we do get our politicians and a selection of parties that can govern for the whole of New Zealand and for the better of New Zealand. And I thank you for your time coming on The Crunch this morning.
All the best, Cam.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. What an amazing interview. And now you've heard it, folks. Michael Bassett thinks that this government is the worst, not just in his living memory, but for all time in New Zealand politics. After promising so much under Jacinda Ardern, they've simply failed to deliver. If Michael Bassett says you're toast, then all that remains to find out is just how badly burned that toast gets. Don't forget to send comments on Michael Bassett's interview to inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.